All right. Well, thank you so much for inviting me. I actually think that your community, I'm really committed to leaving a chunk of time. I hope I don't speak more than 45, 50 minutes. Even that is, I know, will stretch your patience. But I really want to hear from you, because I feel like if contextual integrity can be made useful to your community, I will learn something from it. This is a theory that I've been working on for maybe, a decade, seriously working on it, understanding that it's very much an unfinished product. Philosophically, I think structurally, I'm feeling confident in it, but there are definitely aspects that need to be tested and tried out and massaged, and I want it to be useful above everything. And so really, I think that the community that you guys represent is a real target of opportunity for me. And I also want to say that there's work. I'm going to give you a really bird's eye view of the theory. There are articles, there are applications in different fields. Many people have helped me. And if you're interested in diving into it a little bit more, just about everything is on my website, and feel free to reach out to me as well. By the way, we also have a symposium coming up on applications of contextual integrity, and I would love to give you more information. It just reminded me I should have had a slide with that information. All right, so I want to give you a little bit of background on what motivated me, what inspired me to work on privacy. And the answer to that, even though I'm trained as a philosopher, I have my PhDs in philosophy with some technical background, but not too much of it. But it wasn't so much thinking about privacy as a philosophical issue. What is privacy? How do we define it? It was really the technology. I was looking at, now we call it digital technologies, but it's computers and so forth, information, and seeing that a lot of what these systems do would get a response of people saying, oh, my privacy is violated. And so it wasn't so much I wanted to understand the concept of privacy. I wanted to understand what these technologies were doing that was causing people to identify some unease that they were experiencing as privacy. And I think I've highlighted some of the themes of this conference: model, personalize, recommend, adapt. And all of these, as you all know, are very, very data heavy. You collect the data somehow, either directly with sensors, and you manipulate it, and then you adjust the world around people as a result of this kind of study. And I roamed the conference website to just acclimate myself a little bit. And obviously this is a conference that is very much committed to the world of information or data. And by the way, I use the words information and data interchangeably, although I know some people try to distinguish the two. So it's what activities pose a threat to privacy among the many developments in this area, this broad area of digital technology. Why are people afraid? Why are they angry? When do we think that privacy is violated? And from your point of view, and this is perhaps a challenge to yourselves, because maybe you're here because you're interested in privacy. I want to still do my science. I still want to build stuff. I still want to model. I still want to personalize. I still want to profile. But how can I do this and stay on the right side of privacy as a conscientious data scientist or computer scientist might want to do? And what I hope, and this is something I mentioned just a moment ago, is that I know a little bit about the science and technology. I work mainly on the ethical discussion of privacy, ethics, policy, and so on. And I know that this connection, this bridging of the two is absolutely, it's not a case of I develop the concepts, I throw them over the net, you catch them and you work with them. There really needs to be this connection, this bridging between these two things. Now, some of the technologies, and I'm going to use some of these cases again and again to illustrate details about contextual integrity. So I want to remind you, 2007, Google Maps Street View, we still have it. And at first, people were outraged and they said, oh, my face is shown, my number plate. And there was great concern. Google's engineers responded, or Google responded and said, there are no privacy issues here. This is public. We only photographing, we only creating videos of public streets. No change. Public is public. This is what we're capturing. That was the argument. And then we have a lot of, as you say, sensing, connected things, personalization to improve our lives and so forth, and yet concerns about the different types of ways that data is captured and used. Facial recognition has attracted a lot of negative attention, and many cities are banning it. We see it as a privacy issue. And location tracking is one of the serious issues that many of us are concerned about. Here is something that I think is, I raise it here today because this is a case of adapted personalization. This is how at least we can think about what the newsfeed is, you know, Facebook's attempt to present to you news that, you know, under some positive way of framing it is news they think you will be interested in, or maybe it is news you would be interested in, and so forth. So, but it arises from monitoring, understanding you, and curating your experience of information according to some of these personal characteristics. So how do we take all of these phenomena and achieve, and I use this term very deliberately, it has to be a meaningful concept of privacy. It has to be clear and rigorous. It's faithful to common use, carries moral weight. So if you say, oh, you violated my privacy, this means you've done something unethical and you need to pay attention and do something different. And also, what I've tried to do in collaboration with others is something that can be characterized and defended both with technology and policy. And the theory, as you've heard, is the theory of contextual integrity. And as you see, the articles are available on my website, happy to talk about it. What is contextual integrity? What it isn't? Why it's important, and some applications, although actually the applications will go as the third item on the list, not right at the end. I've had many collaborators and I couldn't have done this work without them. I'm not going to read all the names, but perhaps while I'm talking, you can just cast your eyes over, perhaps you see people that you know, but they're all over. They're from, they're empirical social scientists, they're legal scholars, they're computer scientists, data scientists, and so forth. So the way I'm going to present contextual integrity is to present some of the key ideas. So here are the key ideas of contextual integrity. These are the takeaways. And sometimes it's useful to pair the key idea with something, with what contextual integrity is not, so that you can contrast the implications. Why should I accept this? Well, if you accept this, then it contrasts with some other, what in my view is a privacy truism. And many of these truisms, in my view, give privacy a bad name and also lead us into dead ends. I wanted to remind myself to say that these key ideas are in some sense modular, in that I really think that you can adopt some and then you can reject some. So I will highlight the ones that I think, oh, well, you can say this, but you can disagree with that. We'll see how it goes. So the premise of contextual integrity is that privacy is appropriate flow. So I don't want us to think about a kind of this single arrow vector, you know, it starts here, goes there. I collect information about you. Instead, I want to think about privacy as flow, and then contextual integrity characterizes some flows as appropriate flows and other flows as inappropriate, and some we don't know. So some are indeterminate. And it differs right away from conceptions of privacy that you'll often see, I think, in the computer science literature, where the idea is any sharing of information is a reduction of privacy. And that way of thinking, like data minimization, that's what we want. We want less data. We don't want data to leak. No collection is privacy. This is a problem. If you have privacy be secrecy, it's a problem because data is so important. Data does great things for us. Social life depends on data flows. So if you have a concept that's the opposite of data flow, then it's a concept that you're going to hammer again and again. You're going to take away from it because you know that you can't respect this concept to the strength that it requires. You're always fighting with privacy when you're trying to do a lot of good and, of course, also a lot of bad. So that's the first premise. If I could leave and end this talk right now, and if this is all you remember, I won't be so unhappy. But I also want to say more. Appropriate is conformance with norms. So of course, you know, you're thinking what is appropriate. The theory has to give you some ideas. Other people may have other ideas. I want to say that appropriate flow is flow that conforms with privacy norms. And then we want to talk more about privacy norms and what these norms are: legitimate contextual norms that govern information or data flows. And again, just data, information, I'll probably use them interchangeably throughout the talk. So now let's focus on that third key idea of legitimate contextual norms that govern information or data flows. And we're going to unpack it. What I'm going to do is bracket off legitimate and come back to it later. So we're looking at what are these contextual norms that govern information or data flow. First of all, I want to say for any computer scientists in the audience that by norm, I mean rule, because a norm often means something else for technical people. This took me a few years to figure out why many computer scientists scratched their heads when I talked about norms. And also for legal people, this concept of expectation is also relevant. What you want is what a norm, the fact that there's a norm that governs certain activities in society is often revealed by the fact that people have certain expectations, and in the legal domain, this is really important. A judge will often consider whether a person had a reasonable expectation of privacy. So unpacking this idea of contextual norms, first of all, we want to have, that comes with a theory of society, and it's not really a theory, but it's rather looking at a lot of social theories and understanding that for these theories, that society is not an undifferentiated social space. Rather, we analyze society in terms of these differentiated social spheres Some simple examples: healthcare, education, family, politics, commerce. And these are constituted by the functions that they perform, that are performed in them, practices, the purposes of these contexts. You know, we want to think about what are the purposes of the healthcare context. That really defines that context. What are the purposes of an educational context? And the goals and values. They're distinctive ontologies of roles and information types, and they're norms, they're rules of how to behave, proper behavior. And it doesn't govern everything you do. You know, scratching my nose, is there a norm against or for scratching my nose in the educational context? No, there isn't, as far as I know, at least not where I come from. And among these different norms are contextual, informational, or data flow norms. And these norms can be implicit or explicit. Often rules are understood to be explicit, but norms can also be implicit. Now, how is this different? We're going to come back because this is really important. How the norms, contextual norms, what they are and how they function is really different from some of the other definitions of privacy. But we want to say a little bit more about these contextual informational norms. And that is that there are 5 parameters. The norms have 5 parameters: subject, sender, recipient. So there's the data subject, there's the sender of the data. Sometimes the sender and the subject are the same. There's the recipient of the information, the attributes. I used to say, and I still do, information types. But again, computer scientists often understood types to be a different thing, and I meant the topic, the nature, the attributes. And then, and I'm hoping you're reading just some very concrete instances of the different parameters. And notice that when we're talking about these parameters, the actors are acting in capacities, and the capacities are given by the ontologies of that characterize certain contexts. The transmission principle is something that is a distinctive contribution of contextual integrity, in that it's not that nobody talks about transmission principles, but they're not really pulled out as characteristic of a privacy theory per se. And I've wanted to highlight this because it can shed insight. So when we have data flows, we're saying that the data flows from party to party. And this is what privacy, when we're concerned about privacy, we're concerned about data that's flowing from party to party, but we're interested in the constraints under which that data or that information flows. Now, one of the most important constraints is consent. If it flows with consent, this is acceptable for certain relationships in certain contexts and for certain data types. But there are many other transmission principles that can exist in a norm and can perfectly well contribute or characterize norms that are acceptable, that are appropriate. So when you're filing your tax returns in the United States, that form that you get from the IRS isn't saying, please, with your consent, provide your income, write it into this little box. It says you must. There's compulsion, and nobody says, oh, that violates my privacy. On the other hand, there is a pledge on the other side that the IRS will guard that information, and hence that flows, it's compelled, and it flows in confidence. This confidentiality governs the flow. Sometimes there's notice. So maybe you get a notice that says you're being, there's CCTV is covering this area. That's a notice. Sometimes notice and consent, but sometimes not. Sometimes just notice. Or sometimes you're being observed surreptitiously, and it could be that's acceptable too. In the US, we have this idea of, well, there can be no searches without a warrant, and sometimes the police will go to a judge and get a warrant. So the searching for information or for evidence with a warrant, that is also a transmission principle. And the important thing to note is that all the parameters matter. When you're characterizing acceptable or appropriate data flow, the norm needs to be able to specify all the values. When you're describing a practice, in order to evaluate whether that practice respects privacy, you need to actually describe that practice with all the parameters with values specified for all of the 5 parameters. And if you don't, then you've given us an ambiguous claim, either a description or a norm. Now, I want to just give you a few concrete cases. These are not very complicated. Like, I highlighted them because I remember testing them out, not really, rigorously, but finding that, for example, the Chinese students in my class or Chinese colleagues, if you look at number 2, they would say, yes, of course, universities should provide parents with information about their children's academic progress. Whereas in the US, the law actually requires that the child's permission be given. Whereas in China, the understanding is the parents just need to ask for it and the universities supply that information to them. And so this is also to bring out the point that these norms, there's no problem with cultural differences with norms. And there's a discussion of, we can have a discussion of that. I'm just putting a little asterisk near that. This was work I was really delighted that Anupam Datta was an early collaborator. When he'd heard about the theory of contextual integrity, he thought that you could actually take these norms and provide formal expression, and then obviously some sorts of logic with this formal policy language. But as a first step, one of the things they did is they went through several of the US rules, in this case HIPAA, which is privacy rules for the medical context, and showing that it's not that anyone who was writing these rules said, oh, let's use contextual integrity, but it's really to show that what we've pulled out with contextual integrity is actually a very natural, there's nothing radical. I mean, the whole point with contextual integrity, it's supposed to sit with us as a very intuitive idea. And I've been pleased that particularly people who haven't been indoctrinated with other theoretical approaches or understandings of privacy, contextual integrity rings intuitively true. And this is just one little bit of evidence of this. So just wrapping up this part, which is that contextual integrity requires that data flow respects norm. And when you operationalize these ideas, your norms are expressed as 5 tuples, and then the data flows are described in terms of 5 parameters and then evaluated against the norms. We'll see a little bit of that in a moment, because I think this comes to the how do you put contextual integrity into practice, and this is where I would be really so thrilled to hear from you. Now we come back to some of our cases that we looked at the beginning. When Google said public is public, if they had performed this analysis, they would have immediately seen that even though a person walking down a road could look at the houses, see you sunbathing on your lawn and so forth, or even notice the license plate on your car, it's just you. And often there's reciprocity. So if I see you in the street, often you see me. So there's the transmission principle is reciprocity. Whereas what Google had done in taking videos of these scenes, posting them as part of Google Maps, suddenly someone in Tokyo can see the front of my house, let's say, the facade of my house, or see me sunbathing, or whatever it is. So I'm not commenting good, bad, right, wrong. What I'm explaining is that the intuition that was just brushed aside, you're being irrational, public is public, is actually a response to a significant change. And that was, in this case, recipients and transmission principles. With Facebook, there was a change in transmission principles. And this is a complicated analysis that I won't go into, but it's not the case that things simply stayed the same, but it was how we saw them changed. And I want to introduce personalized medicine because I think here is an instance that's, I don't know if people who are working on personalization in medicine would go to a completely different conference, or whether you have people here who are working on personalization in the health space. But in this case, when you perform personalization of medicine, first of all, the inflow of information, we're taking in vastly expanded information types into the effort to look at the person in a different way when we're trying to personalize their treatment and make it more effective. So if you want to use contextual integrity as a lens through which to look to personalized medicine, you can characterize the differences. Now, let's come back to this. Contextual integrity, just to summarize, what we say is that contextual integrity is preserved when the practice in question or the data flow conforms with legitimate contextual norm. Now, how is this different from entrenched views? And I'm going to distinguish two views of privacy or principles of privacy that are really dominant. First is control over information about ourselves. And the second is that privacy rules apply only to private or sensitive categories or information and not any other. Like with any other, don't worry, just do whatever you want. Now, I could honestly give a whole talk about notice and choice and informed consent. I'm not going to. All I'm saying is if you look at control and consent as the contrast in terms of contextual integrity, what's going on is it's a reductivism. We're reducing privacy to only one parameter, that's the transmission principle, and you're only allowing one value to make the difference, which explains why this is such a thin and brittle understanding of privacy. And we all know that to operationalize privacy as control has been an impossible task. So once again, asserting that all the parameters matter, Now we look at the public-private dichotomy. Once again, we're saying we're reducing privacy to one parameter, that's information type. And we're saying there are only two types of information, private or sensitive information, and all the rest. Anything goes with all of that. And this is where I want to just talk a little bit about applications of these ideas. This is just one area of research that, and simply scratching the surface, because this work with Kirsten Martin came out of our annoyance with the role that this public-private dichotomy was playing in discussions of privacy expectations, as if no one has privacy expectations in public. And I had many years ago written about the right to privacy in public, but here we wanted to do something empirical, and thank goodness Kirsten Martin agreed to collaborate, because of course you'll see her role in this was absolutely essential. So we did 3 studies, and the third one has actually just come out, literally, I don't know, a couple of months ago, which is the location data discussion. What we were showing, there were 3 sets of studies. One is to show that looks at sensitive data, the second looks at public data, and the third looks at location data in public spaces. And I'm going to be very quick, but I'm going to just give you, just one little choice finding in each of these each of these sets of studies. The one was with sensitive information. We validated the classification that Pew had found, and I think Pew's study maybe even takes off from something by Alan Weston, and we looked at these sensitive categories: health, phone, and social security is kind of an outlier, so I'm not going to. It had some really bizarre impacts. Anyway, we had established these are sensitive categories, but what we found, and this is the idea of confounding contextual variables, that when you vary the other parameters, you realize that information type, public-private, is affected by the recipients. And again, it just feels so logical. And yet we still accept defenses of practices. For example, most recently, Google, who says, don't worry, we're not going to classify you according to sensitive information. And what we try and say again and again is that the nature of the information is not the only variable that you have to worry about. In the case of public information, we wanted to show that even, and this is a little bit US-centric because it may be that other countries have different rules, we have these public data sets. This is public data. It exists in the courts or in the counties or the cities. There's data that anyone can get. You can walk into the office. Probably now you can get it online. We again use this factorial vignette survey method. And what we found, so this is the little bit that I wanted to show you. And I love this one about, well, we say you're going to someone's house for a party and you see that it's like, oh, it's this massive property. And you're like, oh, I wonder how much they paid for it. Well, they're data brokers, let's say Zillow or something, where you can type in the address and they can tell you what the price was. Or you can go to the government because property information is public information, or you could ask the people what they paid for it. And you can see how there's enormous variation. And all we want to show here again is that you can't reduce everything, even though this data is public in the sense that it exists in a public data set. It matters who you get it from and how you get it. And then finally, we did a similar kind of study with public spaces and location tracking, same factorial vignette method. And what we again showed is that it depends on who's doing the collecting. We used source of data, like of location data, Fitbit, phone, mapping app, so forth, as a proxy for transmission principle. And you can see there are enormous differences in how people rank the acceptability. And then I was really interested in this, whether precision of location mattered. Turns out doesn't. People are either okay or not okay. Doesn't matter if it's latitude, longitude, precision, or you just say, Helen is in Philadelphia. You know, that people, when you say location, it doesn't matter whether you say street, look, just the word location, latitude, longitude, or city. And this is quite shocking in my view. And then what you find is that if you say Helen is at latitude, longitude, which is very precise, or you say Helen is at the pharmacy, that makes a huge difference. The semantics of that location is enormously significant to how people judge the privacy. So why I'm telling you about these, well, I want to explain how this heuristic could work for you. So when you're considering a practice, is this okay? Am I violating privacy? What would be ideal is mapping the flows. How is this system that I'm about to invent or design or use, how does it affect data flows? And you map these flows in terms of the parameters. We've tried some ideas for visualizing flows. We really need better ways of doing this. If anybody has the capacity to know how to map flows. Locating relevant norms. Again, we did a little bit of that's sort of what we did, Kirsten and I, but it's a massive undertaking. It's an empirical, it's what an anthropologist would do for years, living with a community and trying to understand what the norms and the rules are. And then you want to see whether this flow that you're proposing conforms. Now, I haven't talked about legitimacy, and this is now the last part. This is the last chunk of the theory of contextual integrity. And this is the legitimacy. So why do we need this word? Why do we need this concept at all? We want the norms to be legitimate because sometimes in society you can have entrenched norms that are bad, that are wrong, that are inefficient. And anyone who's dabbled, I say dabbled, me, in critical theory, colleagues will point out to me that entrenched norms are often the rules that are imposed by the powerful on the less powerful. So just the fact that a norm is entrenched doesn't give it an ethical standing by itself. Maybe it gives it a presumption, but it doesn't give it necessarily, it doesn't carry moral weight necessarily because some rules are bad and, as I say, inefficacious. And in particular, technology disruption can be bad, but it can also be good. So even facial recognition can be useful for certain purposes. All of these, the Fitbit, I don't know why anyone would use Ring, but I suppose you could see some benefit to it. Certainly, it disrupts. And same with personalized medicine. Maybe you could argue the same with Facebook's newsfeed. So we really need to figure out whether a practice that is disruptive, like we said, Google Maps Street View, is worth getting rid of the entrenched norms. Do you just say, oh, this is what technology does, if that's okay? And sometimes we don't have clear norms. So, you know, the scratching of my nose, maybe there aren't norms. So we need to have some kind of way to understand or figure out if norms are legitimate. And contextual integrity offers this, and I'm going to be very, you know, give it not enough time, but it offers a process where you go, you evaluate interests and preferences of affected parties. So you compare with and without this technology, how are stakeholders affected. And for example, the community that's looking at fairness, system fairness, fairness in machine learning, bias, and so forth, what they're uncovering is that the use of certain technical system affects parties differentially, and so warning bells. Second, we look at ethical and political principles and values, freedom of speech, liberty, autonomy, so forth. These are societal level values. And here there's a lot of the literature on privacy, in my view, is doing this, looking at some of the technical applications and concerned about how they affect ethical values. So the one I want to dwell on is this one, because it's something a little bit different that contextual integrity brings. If you go back to the definition of context, contexts are defined primarily by purposes. What do they do? So you could have education, an educational context, and it's the way that it's fleshed out in different societies may be different, but we identify them as education because of their purpose. And again, it doesn't shock me. In fact, I expect that the rules and the actors and information types, there would be great variation across times and across cultures. But what we want to say is that to the extent we measure the disruptive flows, the novel flows, against the ones that are pre-existing, that are entrenched, and we evaluate them in terms of these contextual functions, purposes, and values. And I'm just giving you a few. I'm not the expert to tell you what are the functions of healthcare or of education or of the commercial marketplace. So actually, privacy, if you want to have a good discussion of privacy, it's not based on what I know, it's based on what the experts in those fields know. And that's, I think, a difference between contextual integrity and many other theories of privacy. I try to flesh this out a little bit more. I don't know how useful it is, and I'm not going to go through it, but I'm going to give you a minute or two just to see what it looks like. Maybe just not even 1 minute, because just to get a sense of the functions that are taking place, the goals and the purposes and the values. So, you know, when you look at healthcare and you think about equality, it's the kind of thing that a murderer has a heart attack and comes into the hospital. It's not for the doctor to say, I'm not treating this person, he or she is a murderer. It's just, you treat everyone as a human. So that equality of care is what we assume to be one of the values of healthcare. All right, so how does this aspect of contextual integrity differentiate it from other theories of privacy? Many theories of privacy will contrast the beneficiaries of privacy with society. We say that the harms of a violation are only to the individual data subject. And we often will say privacy versus personalization, or versus security, or versus. And contextual integrity argues no, because privacy accepts that appropriate flow is appropriate often because it is furthering contextual ends, purposes, and function. Often the differential privacy community will say, oh, utility versus privacy. No, no, no. A good account of privacy provides useful technologies and systems. And so when we look at why we're concerned about these technologies, they're not because they're collecting information. It's because, just to throw out one concern, chilling political liberties in public spaces. The problem with Cambridge Analytica was not that they didn't get the subject's consent, but it's rather the manipulative practices that had a denigrating effect on democracy. Whoops, sorry. That, as you see, the authors of this article were concerned that this system eroded autonomy and a sense of community. And in this case, we say, oh, you know, personalization, even though it's much more data-centric, produces more efficacious medical treatment. And so if you follow the rules properly, there's nothing wrong with it. You don't have to say personalized medicine versus privacy, because privacy allows that these flows, some of them, are appropriate. And this is now just the summary, which I can end with. The end. Okay, happy to answer questions.